This is Chapter 21 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 21. We were approaching the end of our long journey. It was the morning of the 20th day. At noon, we would reach Carson City, the capital of Nevada Territory. We were not glad, but sorry. It has been a fine pleasure trip. We had fed fat on wonders every day. We were now well accustomed to stage life, and very fond of it. So the idea of coming to a standstill and settling down to a humdrum existence in a village was not agreeable, but on the contrary depressing. Visibly, our new home was a desert, walled in by barren, snow-clad mountains. There was not a tree in sight. There was no vegetation but the endless sagebrush and greasewood. All nature was gray with it. We were plowing through great deeps of powdery alkali dust that rose in thick clouds and floated across the plain like smoke from a burning house. We were coated with it like millers. So were the coach, the mules, the mail bags, the driver. We and the sagebrush and the other scenery were all one monotonous color. Long trains of freight wagons in the distance envelope in ascending masses of dust suggested pictures of prairies on fire. These teams and their masters were the only life we saw. Otherwise we moved in the midst of solitude, silence, and desolation. Every 20 steps we passed the skeleton of some dead beast of burthen, with its dust-coated skin stretched tightly over its empty ribs. Frequently a solemn raven sat upon the skull or the hips and contemplated the passing coach with its meditative serenity. By and by Carson City was pointed out to us. It nestled in the edge of a great plain, and was a sufficient number of miles away to look like an assemblage of mere white spots in the shadow of a grim range of mountains overlooking it, whose summits seemed lifted clear out of companionship and consciousness of earthly things. We arrived, disembarked, and the stage went on. It was a wooden town, its population 2,000 souls. The main street consisted of 4 or 5 blocks of little white frame stores, which were too high to sit down on, but not too high for various other purposes. In fact, hardly high enough. They were packed close together, side by side, as if room were scarce in that mighty plain. The sidewalk was of boards that were more or less loose and inclined to rattle when walked upon. In the middle of the town, opposite the stores, was the plaza, which is native to all towns beyond the Rocky Mountains, a large, unfenced, level vacancy with a liberty pole in it, and very useful as a place for public auctions, horse trades, and mass meetings, and likewise for teamsters to camp in. 2 other sides of the plaza were faced by stores, offices, and stables. The rest of Carson City was pretty scattering. We were introduced to several citizens, at the stage office and on the way up to the governor's from the hotel, among others to a Mr. Harris, who was on horseback. He began to say something, but interrupted himself with the remark, "I'll have to get you to excuse me a minute. Yonder is the witness that swore I helped to rob the California coach. A piece of impertinent intermeddling, sir, for I am not even acquainted with the man." Then he rode over and began to rebuke the stranger with a 6-shooter, and the stranger began to explain with another. When the pistols were emptied, the stranger resumed his work, mending a whiplash, and Mr. Harris rode by with a polite nod, homeward bound, with a bullet through one of his lungs, and several in his hips, and from them issued little rivulets of blood that coursed down the horse's sides and made the animal look quite picturesque. I never saw Harris shoot a man after that, but it recalled to mind that first day in Carson. This was all we saw that day, for it was 2 o'clock now, and according to custom the daily Washu Zephyr set in. A soaring dust drift about the size of the United States set up edgewise came with it, and the capital of Nevada Territory disappeared from view. Still, there were sights to be seen which were not wholly uninteresting to newcomers, for the vast dust cloud was thickly freckled with things strange to the upper air, things living and dead, that flitted hither and thither, coming and going, appearing and disappearing among the rolling billows of dust. Hats, chickens, and parasols sailing in the remote heavens, blankets, tin signs, sagebrush, and shingles a shade lower, doormats and buffalo robes lower still, shovels and coal scuttles on the next grade, glass doors, cats and little children on the next, disrupted lumber yards, light buggies and wheelbarrows on the next, and down only 30 or 40 feet above ground was a scurrying storm of emigrating roofs and vacant lots. It was something to see that much. I could have seen more if I could have kept the dust out of my eyes. But seriously, a Washu wind is by no means a trifling matter. It blows flimsy houses down, lifts shingle roofs occasionally, rolls up tin ones like sheet music, now and then blows a stagecoach over and spills the passengers. And tradition says the reason there are so many bald people there is that the wind blows the hair off their heads while they are looking skyward after their hats. Carson streets seldom look inactive on summer afternoons, because there are so many citizens skipping around their escaping hats like chambermaids trying to head off a spider. The Washu Zephyr (Washu is a pet nickname for Nevada) is a peculiar scriptural wind, in that no man knoweth whence it cometh, that is to say, where it originates. It comes right over the mountains from the west, but when one crosses the ridge he does not find any of it on the other side. It probably is manufactured on the mountain top for the occasion, and starts from there. It is a pretty regular wind in the summertime. Its office hours are from 2 in the afternoon till 2 the next morning, and anybody venturing abroad during those 12 hours needs to allow for the wind, or he will bring up a mile or two to leeward of the point he is aiming at. And yet the first complaint a Washu visitor to San Francisco makes is that the sea winds blow so there. There is a good deal of human nature in that. We found the state palace of the governor of Nevada Territory to consist of a white-frame one-story house with 2 small rooms in it and a stanchion-supported shed in front for grandeur. It compelled the respect of the citizen and inspired the Indians with awe. The newly arrived chief and associate justices of the territory and other machinery of the government were domiciled with less splendor. They were boarding around privately and had their offices in their bedrooms. The secretary and I took quarters in the ranch of a worthy French lady by the name of Bridget O'Flanagan, a camp follower of His Excellency the Governor. She had known him in his prosperity as Commander-in-Chief of the Metropolitan Police of New York, and she would not desert him in his adversity as Governor of Nevada. Our room was on the lower floor, facing the plaza, and when we had got our bed, a small table, 2 chairs, the government fireproof safe, and the unabridged dictionary into it, there was still room enough left for a visitor, maybe 2, but not without straining the walls. But the walls could stand it, at least the partitions could, for they consisted simply of one thickness of white cotton domestic stretched from corner to corner of the room. This was the rule in Carson. Any other kind of partition was the rare exception, and if you stood in a dark corner and your neighbors in the next had lights, the shadows on your canvas told queer secrets sometimes. Very often these partitions were made of old flour sacks basted together, and then the difference between the common herd and the aristocracy was that the common herd had unornamented sacks, while the walls of the aristocrat were overpowering with rudimental fresco, i.e., red and blue mill brands on the flour sacks. Occasionally, also, the better classes embellished their canvas by pasting pictures from Harper's Weekly on them. In many cases, too, the wealthy and the cultured rose to spittoons and other evidences of a sumptuous and luxurious taste. Washu people take a joke so hard that I must explain that the above description was only the rule. There were many honorable exceptions in Carson, plastered ceilings and houses that had considerable furniture in them. M.T. We had a carpet and a genuine Queensware washbowl. Consequently, we were hated without reserve by the other tenants of the O'Flanagan ranch. When we added a painted oilcloth window curtain, we simply took our lives into our own hands. To prevent bloodshed, I removed upstairs and took quarters with the untitled plebeians in one of the 14 white pine cot bedsteads that stood in 2 long ranks in the one sole room of which the second story consisted. It was a jolly company, the 14. They were principally voluntary camp followers of the governor, who had joined his retinue by their own election at New York and San Francisco, and came along feeling that in the scuffle for little territorial crumbs and offices they could not make their condition more precarious than it was, and might reasonably expect to make it better. They were popularly known as the Irish Brigade, though there were only 4 or 5 Irishmen among all the governor's retainers. His good-natured Excellency was much annoyed at the gossip his henchmen created, especially when there arose a rumor that they were paid assassins of his, brought along to quietly reduce the Democratic vote when desirable. Mrs. O'Flanagan was boarding and lodging them at $10 a week apiece, and they were cheerfully giving their notes for it. They were perfectly satisfied, but Bridget presently found that notes that could not be discounted were but a feeble constitution for a Carson boarding-house, so she began to harry the governor to find employment for the brigade. Her importunities and theirs together drove him to a gentle desperation at last, and he finally summoned the brigade to the presence. Then he said, "Gentlemen, I have planned a lucrative and useful service for you, a service which will provide you with recreation amid noble landscapes and afford you never-ceasing opportunities for enriching your minds by observation and study. I want you to survey a railroad from Carson City westward to a certain point. When the legislature meets, I will have the necessary bill passed and the remuneration arranged." "What, a railroad over the Sierra Nevada mountains?" "Well, then, survey it eastward to a certain point." He converted them into surveyors, chain-bearers, and so on, and turned them loose in the desert. It was recreation with a vengeance. Recreation on foot, lugging chains through sand and sagebrush under a sultry sun and among cattle bones, coyotes, and tarantulas. Romantic adventure could go no further. They surveyed very slowly, very deliberately, very carefully. They returned every night during the first week, dusty, footsore, tired, and hungry, but very jolly. They brought in great store of prodigious hairy spiders, tarantulas, and imprisoned them in covered tumblers upstairs in the ranch. After the first week they had to camp on the field, for they were getting well eastward. They made a good many inquiries as to the location of that indefinite certain point, but got no information. At last, to a peculiarly urgent inquiry of how far eastward, Governor Nye telegraphed back, "To the Atlantic Ocean, blast you, and then bridge it and go on." This brought back the dusty toilers, who sent in a report and ceased from their labors. The governor was always comfortable about it. He said Mrs. O'Flanagan would hold him for the brigade's board anyhow, and he intended to get what entertainment he could out of the boys. He said with his old-time pleasant twinkle that he meant to survey them into Utah and then telegraph Brigham to hang them for trespass. The surveyors brought back more tarantulas with them, and so we had quite a menagerie arranged along the shelves of the room. Some of these spiders could straddle over a common saucer with their hairy, muscular legs, and when their feelings were hurt, or their dignity offended, they were the wickedest-looking desperadoes the animal world can furnish. If their glass prison houses were touched ever so lightly, they were up and spoiling for a fight in a minute. Starchy? Proud? Indeed, they would take up a straw and pick their teeth like a member of Congress. There was, as usual, a furious zephyr blowing the first night of the brigade's return, and about midnight the roof of an adjoining stable blew off, and a corner of it came crashing through the side of our ranch. There was a simultaneous awakening, and a tumultuous muster of the brigade in the dark, and a general tumbling and sprawling over each other in the narrow aisle between the bedrows. In the midst of the turmoil, Bob H. sprung up out of a sound sleep and knocked down a shelf with his head. Instantly he shouted, "Turn out, boys, the tarantulas is loose!" No warning ever sounded so dreadful. Nobody tried any longer to leave the room, lest he might step on a tarantula. Every man groped for a trunk or a bed and jumped on it. Then followed the strangest silence. A silence of grisly suspense it was, too, waiting, expectancy, fear. It was as dark as pitch, and one had to imagine the spectacle of those 14 scant-clad men roosting gingerly on trunks and beds, for not a thing could be seen. Then came occasional little interruptions of the silence, and one could recognize a man and tell his locality by his voice, or locate any other sound a sufferer made by his gropings or changes of position. The occasional voices were not given to much speaking. You simply heard a gentle ejaculation of "Ow!" followed by a solid thump, and you knew the gentleman had felt a hairy blanket or something touch his bare skin and had skipped from a bed to the floor. Another silence. Presently you would hear a gasping voice say, "Something's crawling up the back of my neck." Every now and then you could hear a little subdued scramble and a sorrowful, "Oh, Lord!" And then you knew that somebody was getting away from something he took for a tarantula, and not losing any time about it either. Directly a voice in the corner rang out wild and clear, "I've got him! I've got him!" Pause and probable change of circumstances. "No, no, he's got me. Oh, ain't they never going to fetch a lantern?" The lantern came at that moment in the hands of Mrs. O'Flanagan, whose anxiety to know the amount of damage done by the assaulting roof had not prevented her waiting a judicious interval, after getting out of bed and lighting up, to see if the wind was done, now, upstairs, or had a larger contract. The landscape presented when the lantern flashed into the room was picturesque, and might have been funny to some people, but was not to us. Although we were perched so strangely upon boxes, trunks, and beds, and so strangely attired, too, we were too earnestly distressed and too genuinely miserable to see any fun about it, and there was not the semblance of a smile anywhere visible. I know I am not capable of suffering more than I did during those few minutes of suspense in the dark, surrounded by those creeping, bloody-minded tarantulas. I had skipped from bed to bed and from box to box in a cold agony, and every time I touched anything that was furzy, I fancied I felt the fangs. I had rather go to war than live that episode over again. Nobody was hurt. The man who thought a tarantula had got him was mistaken. Only a crack in a box had caught his finger. Not one of those escaped tarantulas was ever seen again. There were 10 or 12 of them. We took candles and hunted the place high and low for them, but with no success. Did we go back to bed then? We did nothing of the kind. Money could not have persuaded us to do it. We sat up the rest of the night playing cribbage and keeping a sharp lookout for the enemy. End of chapter 22. This is chapter 22 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 22. It was the end of August, and the skies were cloudless and the weather superb. In 2 or 3 weeks I had grown wonderfully fascinated with the curious new country, and concluded to put off my return to the States a while. I had grown well accustomed to wearing a damaged slouch hat, blue woolen shirt, and pants crammed into boot tops, and gloried in the absence of coat, vest, and braces. I felt rowdyish and bully, as the historian Josephus phrases it, in his fine chapter upon the destruction of the temple. It seemed to me that nothing could be so fine and so romantic. I had become an officer of the government, but that was for mere sublimity. The office was a unique sinecure. I had nothing to do, and no salary. I was private secretary to His Majesty the Secretary, and there was not yet writing enough for 2 of us. So Johnny K. and I devoted our time to amusement. He was the young son of an Ohio nabob, and was out there for recreation. He got it. We had heard a world of talk about the marvelous beauty of Lake Tahoe, and finally curiosity drove us thither to see it. 3 or 4 members of the brigade had been there and located some timber lands on its shores, and stored up a quantity of provisions in their camp. We strapped a couple of blankets on our shoulders and took an axe apiece and started, for we intended to take up a wood ranch or so ourselves, and become wealthy. We were on foot. The reader will find it advantageous to go horseback. We were told that the distance was 11 miles. We tramped a long time on level ground, and then toiled laboriously up a mountain about 1,000 miles high and looked over. No lake there. We descended on the other side, crossed the valley, and toiled up another mountain 3,000 or 4,000 miles high, apparently, and looked over again. No lake yet. We sat down tired and perspiring, and hired a couple of Chinamen to curse those people who had beguiled us. Thus refreshed, we presently resumed the march with renewed vigor and determination. We plodded on 2 or 3 hours longer, and at last the lake burst upon us. A noble sheet of blue water lifted 6,300 feet above the level of the sea, and walled in by a rim of snow-clad mountain peaks that towered aloft full 3,000 feet higher still. It was a vast oval, and one would have to use up 80 or 100 good miles in traveling around it. As it lay there, with the shadows of the mountains brilliantly photographed upon its still surface, I thought it must surely be the fairest picture the whole earth affords. We found the small skiff belonging to the brigade boys, and without loss of time set out across a deep bend of the lake toward the landmarks that signified the locality of the camp. I got Johnny to row, not because I mind exertion myself, but because it makes me sick to ride backwards when I am at work. But I steered. A 3-mile pull brought us to the camp just as the night fell, and we stepped ashore very tired and wolfishly hungry. In a cache among the rocks we found the provisions and the cooking utensils, and then, all fatigued as I was, I sat down on a boulder and superintended while Johnny gathered wood and cooked supper. Many a man who had gone through what I had would have wanted to rest. It was a delicious supper: hot bread, fried bacon, and black coffee. It was a delicious solitude we were in, too. 3 miles away was a sawmill and some workmen, but there were not 15 other human beings throughout the wide circumference of the lake. As the darkness closed down and the stars came out and spangled the great mirror with jewels, we smoked meditatively in the solemn hush and forgot our troubles and our pains. In due time we spread our blankets in the warm sand between 2 large boulders and soon fell asleep, careless of the procession of ants that passed in through rents in our clothing and explored our persons. Nothing could disturb the sleep that fettered us, for it had been fairly earned, and if our consciences had any sins on them, they had to adjourn court for that night, anyway. The wind rose just as we were losing consciousness, and we were lulled to sleep by the beating of the surf upon the shore. It is always very cold on that lake shore in the night, but we had plenty of blankets and were warm enough. We never moved a muscle all night, but waked at early dawn in the original positions, and got up at once thoroughly refreshed, free from soreness, and brimful of friskiness. There is no end of wholesome medicine in such an experience. That morning we could have whipped 10 such people as we were the day before, sick ones at any rate, but the world is slow, and people will go to water cures and movement cures and to foreign lands for health. 3 months of camp life on Lake Tahoe would restore an Egyptian mummy to his pristine vigor and give him an appetite like an alligator. I do not mean the oldest and driest mummies, of course, but the fresher ones. The air up there in the clouds is very pure and fine, bracing and delicious. But why shouldn't it be? It is the same the angels breathe. I think that hardly any amount of fatigue can be gathered together that a man cannot sleep off in one night on the sand by its side. Not under a roof, but under the sky. It seldom or never rains there in the summertime. I know a man who went there to die, but he made a failure of it. He was a skeleton when he came, and could barely stand. He had no appetite, and did nothing but read tracts and reflect on the future. 3 months later he was sleeping out of doors regularly, eating all he could hold 3 times a day, and chasing game over mountains 3,000 feet high for recreation. And he was a skeleton no longer, but weighed part of a ton. This is no fancy sketch, but the truth. His disease was consumption. I confidently commend his experience to other skeletons. I superintended again, and as soon as we had eaten breakfast we got in the boat and skirted along the lake shore about 3 miles and disembarked. We liked the appearance of the place, and so we claimed some 300 acres of it and stuck our notices on a tree. It was yellow pine timberland, a dense forest of trees 100 feet high and from 1 to 5 feet through at the butt. It was necessary to fence our property or we could not hold it. That is to say, it was necessary to cut down trees here and there and make them fall in such a way as to form a sort of enclosure with pretty wide gaps in it. We cut down 3 trees apiece and found it such heartbreaking work that we decided to rest our case on those. If they held the property, well and good. If they didn't, let the property spill out through the gaps and go. It was no use to work ourselves to death merely to save a few acres of land. Next day we came back to build a house, for a house was also necessary in order to hold the property. We decided to build a substantial log house and excite the envy of the brigade boys, but by the time we had cut and trimmed the first log it seemed unnecessary to be so elaborate, and so we concluded to build it of saplings. However, 2 saplings, duly cut and trimmed, compelled the recognition of the fact that a still modester architecture would satisfy the law, and so we concluded to build a brush house. We devoted the next day to this work, but we did so much sitting around and discussing that by the middle of the afternoon we had achieved only a halfway sort of affair, which one of us had to watch while the other cut brush, lest if both turned our backs we might not be able to find it again. It had such a strong family resemblance to the surrounding vegetation. But we were satisfied with it. We were landowners now, duly seized and possessed, and within the protection of the law. Therefore we decided to take up our residence on our own domain and enjoy that large sense of independence which only such an experience can bring. Late the next afternoon, after a good long rest, we sailed away from the brigade camp with all the provisions and cooking utensils we could carry off. Borrow is the more accurate word, and just as the night was falling, we beached the boat at our own landing. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 23. If there is any life that is happier than the life we led on our timber ranch for the next 2 or 3 weeks, it must be some sort of life which I have not read of in books or experienced in person. We did not see a human being but ourselves during the time, or hear any sounds but those that were made by the wind and the waves, the sighing of the pines, and now and then the far-off thunder of an avalanche. The forest about us was dense and cool. The sky above us was cloudless and brilliant with sunshine. The broad lake before us was glassy and clear, or rippled and breezy, or black and storm-tossed according to nature's mood, and its circling border of mountain domes, clothed with forests, scarred with landslides, cloven with canyons and valleys, and helmeted with glittering snow, fitly framed and finished the noble picture. The view was always fascinating, bewitching, entrancing. The eye was never tired of gazing, night or day, in calm or storm. It suffered but one grief, and that was that it could not look always, but must close sometimes in sleep. We slept in the sand, close to the water's edge, between 2 protecting boulders, which took care of the stormy night winds for us. We never took any paregoric to make us sleep. At the first break of dawn, we were always up and running foot races, to tone down excess of physical vigor and exuberance of spirits. That is, Johnny was, but I held his hat. While smoking the pipe of peace after breakfast, we watched the sentinel peaks put on the glory of the sun, and followed the conquering light as it swept down among the shadows and set the captive crags and forests free. We watched the tinted pictures grow and brighten upon the water till every little detail of forest, precipice, and pinnacle was wrought in and finished, and the miracle of the enchanter complete. Then to business. That is, drifting around in the boat. We were on the north shore. There the rocks on the bottom are sometimes gray, sometimes white. This gives the marvelous transparency of the water a fuller advantage than it has elsewhere on the lake. We usually pushed out 100 yards or so from shore, and then lay down on the thwarts, in the sun, and let the boat drift by the hour whither it would. We seldom talked. It interrupted the Sabbath stillness, and marred the dreams the luxurious rest and indolence brought. The shore all along was indented with deep, curved bays and coves, bordered by narrow sand beaches, and where the sand ended, the steep mountain sides rose right up aloft into space, rose up like a vast wall a little out of perpendicular, and thickly wooded with tall pines. So singularly clear was the water, that where it was only 20 or 30 feet deep, the bottom was so perfectly distinct that the boat seemed floating in the air. Yes, where it was even 80 feet deep. Every little pebble was distinct, every speckled trout, every hand's breadth of sand. Often, as we lay on our faces, a granite boulder as large as a village church would start out of the bottom apparently, and seem climbing up rapidly to the surface, till presently it threatened to touch our faces, and we could not resist the impulse to seize an oar and avert the danger. But the boat would float on, and the boulder descend again, and then we could see that when we had been exactly above it, it must still have been 20 or 30 feet below the surface. Down through the transparency of these great depths the water was not merely transparent, but dazzlingly, brilliantly so. All objects seen through it had a bright, strong vividness, not only of outline, but of every minute detail, which they would not have had when seen simply through the same depths of atmosphere. So empty and airy did all spaces seem below us, and so strong was the sense of floating high aloft in mid-nothingness, that we called these boat excursions balloon voyages. We fished a good deal, but we did not average one fish a week. We could see trout by the thousand winging about in the emptiness under us, or sleeping in shoals on the bottom, but they would not bite. They could see the line too plainly, perhaps. We frequently selected the trout we wanted, and rested the bait patiently and persistently on the end of his nose at a depth of 80 feet, but he would only shake it off with an annoying manner and shift his position. We bathed occasionally, but the water was rather chilly, for it all looked so sunny. Sometimes we rowed out to the blue water, a mile or two from shore. It was as dead blue as indigo there, because of the immense depth. By official measurement, the lake in its center is 1,525 feet deep. Sometimes, on lazy afternoons, we lolled on the sand in camp, and smoked pipes, and read some old well-worn novels. At night, by the campfire, we played euchre and 7-up to strengthen the mind, and played them with cards so greasy and defaced that only a whole summer's acquaintance with them could enable the student to tell the ace of clubs from the jack of diamonds. We never slept in our house. It never recurred to us, for one thing, and, besides, it was built to hold the ground, and that was enough. We did not wish to strain it. By and by our provisions began to run short, and we went back to the old camp and laid in a new supply. We were gone all day, and reached home again about nightfall, pretty tired and hungry. While Johnny was carrying the main bulk of the provisions up to our house for future use, I took the loaf of bread, some slices of bacon, and the coffee pot ashore, set them down by a tree, lit a fire, and went back to the boat to get the frying pan. While I was at this, I heard a shout from Johnny, and looking up I saw that my fire was galloping all over the premises. Johnny was on the other side of it. He had to run through the flames to get to the lake shore, and then we stood helpless and watched the devastation. The ground was deeply carpeted with dry pine needles, and the fire touched them off as if they were gunpowder. It was wonderful to see with what fierce speed the tall sheet of flame traveled. My coffee pot was gone, and everything with it. In a minute and a half the fire seized upon a dense growth of dry manzanita chaparral 6 or 8 feet high, and then the roaring and popping and crackling was something terrific. We were driven to the boat by the intense heat, and there we remained, spellbound. Within half an hour all before us was a tossing, blinding tempest of flame. It went surging up adjacent ridges, surmounted them, and disappeared in the canyons beyond, burst into view upon higher and farther ridges presently, shed a grander illumination abroad, and dove again, flamed out again, directly, higher and still higher up the mountainside, threw out skirmishing parties of fire here and there, and then sent them trailing their crimson spirals away among remote ramparts and ribs and gorges, till as far as the eye could reach the lofty mountain fronts were webbed, as it were, with a tangled network of red lava streams. Away across the water the crags and domes were lit with a ruddy glare, and the firmament above was a reflected hell. Every feature of the spectacle was repeated in the glowing mirror of the lake. Both pictures were sublime, both were beautiful, but that in the lake had a bewildering richness about it that enchanted the eye and held it with a stronger fascination. We sat absorbed and motionless through 4 long hours. We never thought of supper, and never felt fatigue. But at 11 o'clock the conflagration had traveled beyond our range of vision, and then darkness stole down upon the landscape again. Hunger asserted itself now, but there was nothing to eat. The provisions were all cooked, no doubt, but we did not go to sea. We were homeless wanderers again, without any property. Our fence was gone, our house burned down, no insurance. Our pine forest was well scorched, the dead trees all burned up, and our broad acres of manzanita swept away. Our blankets were on our usual sand bed, however, and so we lay down and went to sleep. The next morning we started back to the old camp, but while out a long way from shore, so great a storm came up that we dared not try to land. So I bailed out the seas we shipped, and Johnny pulled heavily through the billows till we had reached a point 3 or 4 miles beyond the camp. The storm was increasing, and it became evident that it was better to take the hazard of beaching the boat than go down in 100 fathoms of water. So we ran in, with tall whitecaps following, and I sat down in the stern sheets and pointed her head on to the shore. The instant the bow struck, a wave came over the stern that washed crew and cargo ashore and saved a deal of trouble. We shivered in the lee of a boulder all the rest of the day, and froze all the night through. In the morning the tempest had gone down, and we paddled down to the camp without any unnecessary delay. We were so starved that we ate up the rest of the brigade's provisions, and then set out to Carson to tell them about it and ask their forgiveness. It was accorded upon payment of damages. We made many trips to the lake after that, and had many a hair-breadth escape and blood-curdling adventure which will never be recorded in any history. End of chapter 23. This is Chapter 24 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 24. I resolved to have a horse to ride. I had never seen such wild, free, magnificent horsemanship outside of a circus as these picturesquely clad Mexicans, Californians, and Mexicanized Americans displayed in Carson streets every day. How they rode! Leaning just gently forward out of the perpendicular, easy and nonchalant, with broad slouch hat brim blown square up in front, and long riata swinging above the head, they swept through the town like the wind. The next minute they were only a sailing puff of dust on a far desert. If they trotted, they sat up gallantly and gracefully, and seemed part of the horse. Did not go jiggering up and down after the silly Miss Nancy fashion of the riding schools. I had quickly learned to tell a horse from a cow, and was full of anxiety to learn more. I was resolved to buy a horse. While the thought was rankling in my mind, the auctioneer came scurrying through the plaza on a black beast that had as many humps and corners on him as a dromedary, and was necessarily uncomely. But he was going at 22, horse, saddle, and bridle at $22, gentlemen, and I could hardly resist. A man whom I did not know, he turned out to be the auctioneer's brother, noticed the wistful look in my eye, and observed that that was a very remarkable horse to be going at such a price, and added that the saddle alone was worth the money. It was a Spanish saddle, with ponderous tapidaros, and furnished with the ungainly sole leather covering with the unspellable name. I said I had half a notion to bid. Then this keen-eyed person appeared to me to be taking my measure, but I dismissed the suspicion when he spoke, for his manner was full of guileless candor and truthfulness. Said he, "I know that horse, know him well. You are a stranger, I take it, and so you might think he was an American horse, maybe, but I assure you he is not. He is nothing of the kind. But, excuse my speaking in a low voice, other people being near, he is, without the shadow of a doubt, a genuine Mexican plug." I did not know what a genuine Mexican plug was, but there was something about this man's way of saying it that made me swear inwardly that I would own a genuine Mexican plug or die. "Has he any other advantages?" I inquired, suppressing what eagerness I could. He hooked his forefinger in the pocket of my army shirt, led me to one side, and breathed in my ear impressively these words: "He can outbuck anything in America. Going at $24.50, 27," I shouted in a frenzy. "And sold," said the auctioneer, and passed over the genuine Mexican plug to me. I could scarcely contain my exultation. I paid the money, and put the animal in a neighboring livery stable to dine and rest himself. In the afternoon I brought the creature into the plaza, and certain citizens held him by the head and others by the tail, while I mounted him. As soon as they let go, he placed all his feet in a bunch together, lowered his back, and then suddenly arched it upward, and shot me straight into the air a matter of 3 or 4 feet. I came as straight down again, lit in the saddle, went instantly up again, came down almost on the high pommel, shot up again, and came down on the horse's neck, all in the space of 3 or 4 seconds. Then he rose and stood almost straight up on his hind feet, and I, clasping his lean neck desperately, slid back into the saddle and held on. He came down, and immediately hoisted his heels into the air, delivering a vicious kick at the sky, and stood on his 4 feet. Then down he came once more, and began the original exercise of shooting me straight up again. The third time I went up I heard a stranger say, "Whoa, don't he buck, though!" While I was up, somebody struck the horse a sounding thwack with a leathern strap, and when I arrived again the genuine Mexican Plug was not there. A California youth chased him up and caught him, and asked if he might have a ride. I granted him that luxury. He mounted the Genuine, got lifted into the air once, but sent his spurs home as he descended, and the horse darted away like a telegram. He soared over 3 fences like a bird, and disappeared down the road toward the Washu Valley. I sat down on a stone with a sigh, and by a natural impulse one of my hands sought my forehead, and the other the base of my stomach. I believe I never appreciated till then the poverty of the human machinery, for I still needed a hand or two to place elsewhere. Pen cannot describe how I was jolted up. Imagination cannot conceive how disjointed I was, how internally, externally, and universally I was unsettled, mixed up, and ruptured. There was a sympathetic crowd around me, though. One elderly-looking comforter said, "Stranger, you've been taken in. Everybody in this camp knows that horse. Any child, any Injun could have told you that he'd buck. He is the very worst devil to buck on the continent of America. You hear me? I'm Curry, old Abe Curry, and moreover he is a Simon Pure, out-and-out, genuine, damned Mexican Plug, and an uncommon mean one at that, too. Why, you turnip, if you had laid low and kept dark, there's chances to buy an American horse for mighty little more than you paid for that bloody old foreign relic." I gave no sign, but I made up my mind that if the auctioneer's brother's funeral took place while I was in the Territory, I would postpone all other recreations and attend it. After a gallop of 16 miles, the Californian youth and the genuine Mexican Plug came tearing into town again, shedding foam flakes like the spume spray that dries before a typhoon, and with one final skip over a wheelbarrow and a Chinaman, cast anchor in front of the ranch. Such panting and blowing! Such spreading and contracting of the red equine nostrils, and glaring of the wild equine eye! But was the imperial beast subjugated? Indeed he was not. His lordship, the Speaker of the House, thought he was, and mounted him to go down to the Capitol. But the first dash the creature made was over a pile of telegraph poles half as high as a church, and his time to the Capitol, 1 mile and 3/4, remains unbeaten to this day. But then he took an advantage. He left out the mile, and only did the 3/4. That is to say, he made a straight cut across lots, preferring fences and ditches to a crooked road, and when the Speaker got to the Capitol, he said he had been in the air so much he felt as if he had made the trip on a comet. In the evening the Speaker came home afoot for exercise, and got the Genuine towed back behind a quartz wagon. The next day I loaned the animal to the clerk of the House to go down to the Dana silver mine 6 miles, and he walked back for exercise, and got the horse towed. Everybody I loaned him to always walked back. They never could get enough exercise any other way. Still, I continued to loan him to anybody who was willing to borrow him, my idea being to get him crippled, and throw him on the borrower's hands, or killed, and make the borrower pay for him. But somehow nothing ever happened to him. He took chances that no other horse ever took and survived, but he always came out safe. It was his daily habit to try experiments that had always before been considered impossible, but he always got through. Sometimes he miscalculated a little and did not get his rider through intact, but he always got through himself. Of course, I had tried to sell him, but that was a stretch of simplicity which met with little sympathy. The auctioneer stormed up and down the streets on him for 4 days, dispersing the populace, interrupting business, and destroying children, and never got a bid. At least never any but the $18 one he hired a notoriously substanceless bummer to make. The people only smiled pleasantly, and restrained their desire to buy, if they had any. Then the auctioneer brought in his bill, and I withdrew the horse from the market. We tried to trade him off at private vendue next, offering him at a sacrifice for second-hand tombstones, old iron, temperance tracts, any kind of property. But holders were stiff, and we retired from the market again. I never tried to ride the horse any more. Walking was good enough exercise for a man like me, that had nothing the matter with him except ruptures, internal injuries, and such things. Finally I tried to give him away, but it was a failure. Parties said earthquakes were handy enough on the Pacific coast, they did not wish to own one. As a last resort I offered him to the governor for the use of the brigade. His face lit up eagerly at first, but toned down again, and he said the thing would be too palpable. Just then the livery stable man brought in his bill for 6 weeks' keeping. Stall room for the horse, $15. Hay for the horse, $250. The genuine Mexican plug had eaten a ton of the article, and the man said he would have eaten 100 if he had let him. I will remark here, in all seriousness, that the regular price of hay during that year and a part of the next was really $250 a ton. During a part of the previous year it had sold at $500 a ton, in gold, and during the winter before that there was a scarcity of the article that in several instances small quantities had brought $800 a ton in coin. The consequence might be guessed without my telling it. People turned their stock loose to starve, and before the spring arrived Carson and Eagle Valleys were almost literally carpeted with their carcasses. Any old settler there will verify these statements. I managed to pay the livery bill, and that same day I gave the genuine Mexican plug to a passing Arkansas emigrant, whom fortune delivered into my hand. If this ever meets his eye, he will doubtless remember the donation. Now, whoever has had the luck to ride a real Mexican plug will recognize the animal depicted in this chapter, and hardly consider him exaggerated. But the uninitiated will feel justified in regarding his portrait as a fancy sketch, perhaps. End of chapter 24. This is chapter 25 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 25. Originally, Nevada was a part of Utah, and was called Carson County, and a pretty large county it was, too. Certain of its valleys produced no end of hay, and this attracted small colonies of Mormon stock raisers and farmers to them. A few orthodox Americans straggled in from California, but no love was lost between the two classes of colonists. There was little or no friendly intercourse. Each party stayed to itself. The Mormons were largely in the majority, and had the additional advantage of being peculiarly under the protection of the Mormon government of the territory. Therefore, they could afford to be distant and even peremptory toward their neighbors. One of the traditions of Carson Valley illustrates the condition of things that prevailed at the time I speak of. The hired girl of one of the American families was Irish and a Catholic. Yet it was noted with surprise that she was the only person outside of the Mormon ring who could get favors from the Mormons. She asked kindnesses of them often, and always got them. It was a mystery to everybody. But one day, as she was passing out at the door, a large bowie knife dropped from under her apron, and when her mistress asked for an explanation, she observed that she was going out to borry a washtub from the Mormons. In 1858, silver lodes were discovered in Carson County, and then the aspect of things changed. Californians began to flock in, and the American element was soon in the majority. Allegiance to Brigham Young and Utah was renounced, and a temporary territorial government for Washu was instituted by the citizens. Governor Roop was the first and only chief magistrate of it. In due course of time, Congress passed a bill to organize Nevada Territory, and President Lincoln sent out Governor Nye to supplant Roop. At this time, the population of the territory was about 12 or 15,000, and rapidly increasing. Silver mines were being vigorously developed and silver mills erected. Business of all kinds was active and prosperous and growing more so day by day. The people were glad to have a legitimately constituted government, but did not particularly enjoy having strangers from distant states put in authority over them, a sentiment that was natural enough. They thought the officials should have been chosen from among themselves, from among prominent citizens who had earned a right to such promotion, and who would be in sympathy with the populace and likewise thoroughly acquainted with the needs of the territory. They were right in viewing the matter thus, without doubt. The new officers were emigrants, and that was no title to anybody's affection or admiration either. The new government was received with considerable coolness. It was not only a foreign intruder, but a poor one. It was not even worth plucking, except by the smallest of small fry office-seekers and such. Everybody knew that Congress had appropriated only $20,000 a year in greenbacks for its support, about money enough to run a quartz mill a month. And everybody knew, also, that the first year's money was still in Washington, and that the getting hold of it would be a tedious and difficult process. Carson City was too wary and too wise to open up a credit account with the imported bantling with anything like indecent haste. There is something solemnly funny about the struggles of a newborn territorial government to get a start in this world. Ours had a trying time of it. The Organic Act and the instructions from the State Department commanded that a legislature should be elected at such and such a time and its sittings inaugurated at such and such a date. It was easy to get legislators, even at $3 a day, although board was $4.50, for distinction has its charms in Nevada as well as elsewhere, and there were plenty of patriotic souls out of employment, but to get a legislative hall for them to meet in was another matter altogether. Carson blandly declined to give a room rent-free or let one to the government on credit. But when Curry heard of the difficulty, he came forward, solitary and alone, and shouldered the ship of state over the bar and got her afloat again. I refer to Curry, old Abe Curry. But for him the legislature would have been obliged to sit in the desert. He offered his large stone building just outside the Capitol limits, rent-free, and it was gladly accepted. Then he built a horse railroad from town to the Capitol and carried the legislators gratis. He also furnished pine benches and chairs for the legislature, and covered the floors with clean sawdust by way of carpet and spittoon combined. But for Curry, the government would have died in its tender infancy. A canvas partition to separate the Senate from the House of Representatives was put up by the Secretary at a cost of $3.40, but the United States declined to pay for it. Upon being reminded that the instructions permitted the payment of a liberal rent for a legislative hall, and that money was saved to the country by Mr. Curry's generosity, the United States said that it did not alter the matter, and the $3.40 would be subtracted from the Secretary's $1,800 salary, and it was. The matter of printing was from the beginning an interesting feature of the new government's difficulties. The Secretary was sworn to obey his volume of written instructions, and these commanded him to do two certain things without fail, viz., 1. Get the House and Senate journals printed, and 2. For this work pay $1.50 per thousand for composition and $1.50 per token for press work, in greenbacks. It was easy to swear to do these two things, but it was entirely impossible to do more than one of them. When greenbacks had gone down to 40 cents on the dollar, the prices regularly charged everybody by printing establishments were $1.50 per thousand and $1.50 per token in gold. The instructions commanded that the Secretary regard a paper dollar issued by the government as equal to any other dollar issued by the government. Hence, the printing of the journals was discontinued. Then the United States sternly rebuked the Secretary for disregarding the instructions and warned him to correct his ways. Wherefore he got some printing done, forwarded the bill to Washington with full exhibits of the high prices of things in the territory, and called attention to a printed market report wherein it would be observed that even hay was $250 a ton. The United States responded by subtracting the printing bill from the Secretary's suffering salary, and moreover remarked with dense gravity that he would find nothing in his instructions requiring him to purchase hay. Nothing in this world is palled in such impenetrable obscurity as a U.S. Treasury comptroller's understanding. The very fires of the hereafter could get up nothing more than a fitful glimmer in it. In the days I speak of, he never could be made to comprehend why it was that $20,000 would not go as far in Nevada, where all commodities ranged at enormous figure, as it would in the other territories, where exceeding cheapness was the rule. He was an officer who looked out for the little expenses all the time. The secretary of the territory kept his office in his bedroom, as I before remarked, and he charged the United States no rent, although his instructions provided for that item, and he could have justly taken advantage of it, a thing which I would have done with more than lightning promptness if I had been secretary myself. But the United States never applauded this devotion. Indeed, I think my country was ashamed to have so improvident a person in its employ. Those instructions, we used to read a chapter from them every morning, as intellectual gymnastics, and a couple of chapters in Sunday school every Sabbath, for they treated of all subjects under the sun, and had much valuable religious matter in them along with the other statistics. Those instructions commanded that pen-knives, envelopes, pens, and writing paper be furnished the members of the legislature. So the secretary made the purchase and the distribution. The knives cost $3 apiece. There was one too many, and the secretary gave it to the clerk of the House of Representatives. The United States said the clerk of the House was not a member of the legislature, and took that $3 out of the secretary's salary, as usual. White men charged $3 or $4 a load for sawing up stove wood. The secretary was sagacious enough to know that the United States would never pay any such price as that, so he got an Indian to saw up a load of office wood at $1.50. He made out the usual voucher, but signed no name to it, simply appended a note explaining that an Indian had done the work, and had done it in a very capable and satisfactory way, but could not sign the voucher, owing to lack of ability in the necessary direction. The secretary had to pay that $1.50. He thought the United States would admire both his economy and his honesty in getting the work done at half price, and not putting a pretended Indian signature to the voucher, but the United States did not see it in that light. The United States was too much accustomed to employing $1.50 thieves in all manner of official capacities to regard his explanation of the voucher as having any foundation in fact. But the next time the Indian sawed wood for us, I taught him to make a cross at the bottom of the voucher. It looked like a cross that had been drunk a year, and then I witnessed it, and it went through all right. The United States never said a word. I was sorry I had not made the voucher for 1,000 loads of wood instead of one. The government of my country snubs honest simplicity, but fondles artistic villainy, and I think I might have developed into a very capable pickpocket if I had remained in the public service a year or two. That was a fine collection of sovereigns, that first Nevada legislature. They levied taxes to the amount of $30,000 or $40,000 and ordered expenditures to the extent of about $1 million. Yet they had their little periodical explosions of economy, like all other bodies of the kind. A member proposed to save $3 a day to the nation by dispensing with a chaplain, and yet that short-sighted man needed the chaplain more than any other member, perhaps, for he generally sat with his feet on his desk, eating raw turnips during that morning prayer. The legislature sat 60 days, and passed private toll road franchises all the time. When they adjourned, it was estimated that every citizen owned about 3 franchises, and it was believed that unless Congress gave the territory another degree of longitude, there would not be room enough to accommodate the toll roads. The ends of them were hanging over the boundary lines everywhere like a fringe. The fact is, the freighting business had grown to such important proportions that there was nearly as much excitement over suddenly acquired toll road fortunes as over the wonderful silver mines. End of chapter 25. This is Chapter 26 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 26. By and by, I was smitten with the silver fever. Prospecting parties were leaving for the mountains every day, and discovering and taking possession of rich, silver-bearing lodes and ledges of quartz. Plainly, this was the road to fortune. The great Gould and Curry mine was held at $300 or $400 a foot when we arrived, but in 2 months it had sprung up to $800. The Ophir had been worth only a mere trifle a year gone by, and now it was selling at nearly $4,000 a foot. Not a mine could be named that had not experienced an astonishing advance in value within a short time. Everybody was talking about these marvels. Go where you would, you heard nothing else, from morning till far into the night. Tom So-and-so had sold out of the Amanda Smith for $40,000, hadn't a cent when he took up the ledge 6 months ago. John Jones had sold half his interest in the Bald Eagle and Marianne for $65,000 gold coin, and gone to the States for his family. The widow Brewster had struck it rich in the Golden Fleece, and sold 10 feet for $18,000. Hadn't money enough to buy a crepe bonnet when Sing Sing Tommy killed her husband at Baldy Johnson's wake last spring. The Last Chance had found a clay casing and knew they were right on the ledge. Consequence, feet that went begging yesterday were worth a brick house apiece today, and seedy owners who could not get trusted for a drink at any bar in the country yesterday were roaring drunk on champagne today, and hosts of warm personal friends in a town where they had forgotten how to bow or shake hands from long-continued want of practice. Johnny Morgan, a common loafer, had gone to sleep in the gutter and waked up worth $100,000 in consequence of the decision in the Lady Franklin and Rough and Ready lawsuit. And so on, day in and day out, the talk pelted our ears, and the excitement waxed hotter and hotter around us. I would have been more or less than human if I had not gone mad like the rest. Cartloads of solid silver bricks, as large as pigs of lead, were arriving from the mills every day, and such sights as that gave substance to the wild talk about me. I succumbed, and grew as frenzied as the craziest. Every few days news would come of the discovery of a brand new mining region. Immediately the papers would teem with accounts of its richness, and away the surplus population would scamper to take possession. By the time I was fairly inoculated with the disease, Esmeralda had just had a run, and Humboldt was beginning to shriek for attention. Humboldt, Humboldt, was the new cry, and straightway Humboldt, the newest of the new, the richest of the rich, the most marvelous of the marvelous discoveries in Silverland, was occupying 2 columns of the public prints to Esmeralda's 1. I was just on the point of starting to Esmeralda, but turned with the tide and got ready for Humboldt. That the reader may see what moved me, and what would as surely have moved him had he been there, I insert here one of the newspaper letters of the day. It, and several other letters from the same calm hand, were the main means of converting me. I shall not garble the extract, but put it in just as it appeared in the Daily Territorial Enterprise. What about our mines? I shall be candid with you. I shall express an honest opinion, based upon a thorough examination. Humboldt County is the richest mineral region upon God's footstool. Each mountain range is gorged with the precious ores. Humboldt is the true Golconda. The other day an assay of mere croppings yielded exceeding $4,000 to the ton. A week or 2 ago an assay of just such surface developments made returns of $7,000 to the ton. Our mountains are full of rambling prospectors. Each day and almost every hour reveals new and more startling evidences of the profuse and intensified wealth of our favored county. The metal is not silver alone. There are distinct ledges of auriferous ore. A late discovery plainly evinces cinnabar. The coarser metals are in gross abundance. Lately evidences of bituminous coal have been detected. My theory has ever been that coal is a ligneous formation. I told Colonel Whitman in times past that the neighborhood of Dayton, Nevada, betrayed no present or previous manifestations of a ligneous foundation, and that hence I had no confidence in his lauded coal mines. I repeated the same doctrine to the exultant coal discoverers of Humboldt. I talked with my friend Captain Birch on the subject. My Pyrrhonism vanished upon his statement that in the very region referred to he had seen petrified trees of the length of 200 feet. Then is the fact established that huge forests once cast their grim shadows over this remote section. I am firm in the coal faith. Have no fears of the mineral resources of Humboldt County. They are immense, incalculable. Let me state one or two things which will help the reader to better comprehend certain items in the above. At this time our near neighbor, Gold Hill, was the most successful silver mining locality in Nevada. It was from there that more than half the daily shipments of silver bricks came. Very rich and scarce, Gold Hill ore yielded from $100 to $400 to the ton, but the usual yield was only $20 to $40 per ton. That is to say, each 100 pounds of ore yielded from $1 to $2. But the reader will perceive by the above extract that in Humboldt from 1/4 to nearly half the mass was silver. That is to say, every 100 pounds of the ore had from $200 up to $350 in it. Some days later this same correspondent wrote: I have spoken of the vast and almost fabulous wealth of this region. It is incredible. The intestines of our mountains are gorged with precious ore to plethora. I have said that nature has so shaped our mountains as to furnish most excellent facilities for the working of our mines. I have also told you that the country about here is pregnant with the finest mill sites in the world. But what is the mining history of Humboldt? The Sheba mine is in the hands of energetic San Francisco capitalists. It would seem that the ore is combined with metals that render it difficult of reduction with our imperfect mountain machinery. The proprietors have combined the capital and labor hinted at in my exordium. They are toiling and probing. Their tunnel has reached the length of 100 feet. From primal assays alone, coupled with the development of the mine and public confidence in the continuance of effort, the stock had reared itself to $800 market value. I do not know that 1 ton of the ore has been converted into current metal. I do know that there are many lodes in this section that surpass the Sheba in primal assay value. Listen a moment to the calculations of the Sheba operators. They propose transporting the ore concentrated to Europe. The conveyance from Star City, its locality, to Virginia City will cost $70 per ton. From Virginia to San Francisco, $40 per ton. From thence to Liverpool, its destination, $10 per ton. Their idea is that its conglomerate metals will reimburse them their cost of original extraction, the price of transportation, and the expense of reduction, and that then a ton of the raw ore will net them $1,200. The estimate may be extravagant. Cut it in twain, and the product is enormous, far transcending any previous developments of our racy territory. A very common calculation is that many of our mines will yield $500 to the ton. Such fecundity throws the Gould and Curry, the Ophir, and the Mexican of our neighborhood in the darkest shadow. I have given you the estimate of the value of a single developed mine. Its richness is indexed by its market valuation. The people of Humboldt County are feet crazy. As I write, our towns are near deserted. They look as languid as a consumptive girl. What has become of our sinewy and athletic fellow citizens? They are coursing through ravines and over mountain tops. Their tracks are visible in every direction. Occasionally a horseman will dash among us. His steed betrays hard usage. He alights before his adobe dwelling, hastily exchanges courtesies with his townsmen, hurries to an assay office, and from thence to the district recorder's. In the morning, having renewed his provisional supplies, he is off again on his wild and unbeaten route. Why, the fellow numbers already his feet by the thousands. He is the horse leech. He has the craving stomach of the shark or anaconda. He would conquer metallic worlds. This is enough. The instant we had finished reading the above article, 4 of us decided to go to Humboldt. We commenced getting ready at once, and we also commenced upbraiding ourselves for not deciding sooner, for we were in terror lest all the rich mines would be found and secured before we got there. and we might have to put up with ledges that would not yield more than $200 or $300 a ton, maybe. An hour before, I would have felt opulent if I had owned 10 feet in a Gold Hill mine whose ore produced $25 to the ton. Now I was already annoyed at the prospect of having to put up with mines, the poorest of which would be a marvel in Gold Hill. End of chapter 26. This is chapter 27 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 27. Hurry was the word. We wasted no time. Our party consisted of 4 persons, a blacksmith, 60 years of age, 2 young lawyers, and myself. We bought a wagon and 2 miserable old horses. We put 1,800 pounds of provisions and mining tools in the wagon, and drove out of Carson on a chilly December afternoon. The horses were so weak and old that we soon found that it would be better if 1 or 2 of us got out and walked. It was an improvement. Next we found that it would be better if a 3rd man got out. That was an improvement also. It was at this time that I volunteered to drive, although I had never driven a harnessed horse before, and many a man in such a position would have felt fairly excused from such a responsibility. But in a little while it was found that it would be a fine thing if the driver got out and walked also. It was at this time that I resigned the position of driver, and never resumed it again. Within the hour we found that it would not only be better, but was absolutely necessary that we 4, taking turns, 2 at a time, should put our hands against the end of the wagon and push it through the sand, leaving the feeble horses little to do but keep out of the way and hold up the tongue. Perhaps it is well for one to know his fate at first and get reconciled to it. We had learned ours in 1 afternoon. It was plain that we had to walk through the sand and shove that wagon and those horses 200 miles. So we accepted the situation, and from that time forth we never rode. More than that, we stood regular and nearly constant watches, pushing up behind. We made 7 miles, and camped in the desert. Young Claggett, now member of Congress from Montana, unharnessed and fed and watered the horses. Oliphant and I cut sagebrush, built the fire, and brought water to cook with, and old Mr. Ballou, the blacksmith, did the cooking. This division of labor and this appointment was adhered to throughout the journey. We had no tent, and so we slept under our blankets in the open plain. We were so tired that we slept soundly. We were 15 days making the trip, 200 miles. 13 rather, for we lay by a couple of days in one place to let the horses rest. We could really have accomplished the journey in 10 days if we had towed the horses behind the wagon, but we did not think of that until it was too late, and so went on shoving the horses and the wagon too, when we might have saved half the labor. Parties who met us occasionally advised us to put the horses in the wagon, but Mr. Ballou, through whose ironclad earnestness no sarcasm could pierce, said that that would not do, because the provisions were exposed and would suffer, the horses being bituminous from long deprivation. The reader will excuse me from translating. What Mr. Ballou customarily meant when he used a long word was a secret between himself and his Maker. He was one of the best and kindest-hearted men that ever graced a humble sphere of life. He was gentleness and simplicity itself, and unselfishness, too. Although he was more than twice as old as the eldest of us, he never gave himself any airs, privileges, or exemptions on that account. He did a young man's share of the work, and did his share of conversing and entertaining from the general standpoint of any age, not from the arrogant, overawing summit height of 60 years. His one striking peculiarity was his Partingtonian fashion of loving and using big words for their own sakes, and independent of any bearing they might have upon the thought he was proposing to convey. He always let his ponderous syllables fall with an easy unconsciousness that left them wholly without offensiveness. In truth, his air was so natural and so simple that one was always catching himself accepting his stately sentences as meaning something when they really meant nothing in the world. If a word was long and grand and resonant, that was sufficient to win the old man's love, and he would drop that word into the most out-of-the-way place in a sentence or a subject, and be as pleased with it as if it were perfectly luminous with meaning. We four always spread our common stock of blankets together on the frozen ground and slept side by side, and, finding that our foolish long-legged hound pup had a deal of animal heat in him, Oliphant got to admitting him to the bed, between himself and Mr. Ballou, hugging the dog's warm back to his breast and finding great comfort in it. But in the night the pup would get stretchy and brace his feet against the old man's back and shove, grunting complacently the while, and now and then, being warm and snug, grateful and happy, he would paw the old man's back simply in excess of comfort, and at yet other times he would dream of the chase and, in his sleep, tug at the old man's back hair and bark in his ear. The old gentleman complained mildly about these familiarities at last, and when he got through with his statement he said that such a dog as that was not a proper animal to admit to bed with tired men, because he was so meretricious in his movements and so organic in his emotions. We turned the dog out. It was a hard, wearing, toilsome journey, but it had its bright side, for after each day was done and our wolfish hunger appeased with a hot supper of fried bacon, bread, molasses, and black coffee, the pipe-smoking, song-singing, and yarn-spinning around the evening campfire in the still solitudes of the desert was a happy, carefree sort of recreation that seemed the very summit and culmination of earthly luxury. It is a kind of life that has a potent charm for all men, whether city or country bred. We are descended from desert lounging Arabs, and countless ages of growth toward perfect civilization have failed to root out of us the nomadic instinct. We all confess to a gratified thrill at the thought of camping out. Once we made 25 miles in a day, and once we made 40 miles through the great American desert, and 10 miles beyond, 50 in all, in 23 hours, without halting to eat, drink, or rest. To stretch out and go to sleep, even on stony and frozen ground, after pushing a wagon and 2 horses 50 miles, is a delight so supreme that for the moment it almost seems cheap at the price. We camped 2 days in the neighborhood of the sink of the Humboldt. We tried to use the strong alkaline water of the sink, but it would not answer. It was like drinking lye, and not weak lye either. It left a taste in the mouth, bitter and every way execrable, and a burning in the stomach that was very uncomfortable. We put molasses in it, but that helped it very little. We added a pickle, yet the alkali was the prominent taste, and so it was unfit for drinking. The coffee we made of this water was the meanest compound man has yet invented. It was really viler to the taste than the unameliorated water itself. Mr. Ballou, being the architect and builder of the beverage, felt constrained to endorse and uphold it, and so drank half a cup, by little sips, making shift to praise it faintly the while, but finally threw out the remainder and said frankly it was too technical for him. But presently we found a spring of fresh water convenient, and then, with nothing to mar our enjoyment and no stragglers to interrupt it, we entered into our rest. End of chapter 27. This is chapter 28 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 28. After leaving the sink, we traveled along the Humboldt River a little way. People accustomed to the monster mile-wide Mississippi grow accustomed to associating the term river with a high degree of watery grandeur. Consequently, such people feel rather disappointed when they stand on the shores of the Humboldt or the Carson and find that a river in Nevada is a sickly rivulet which is just the counterpart of the Erie Canal in all respects save that the canal is twice as long and 4 times as deep. One of the pleasantest and most invigorating exercises one can contrive is to run and jump across the Humboldt River till he is overheated, and then drink it dry. On the 15th day we completed our march of 200 miles and entered Unionville, Humboldt County, in the midst of a driving snowstorm. Unionville consisted of 11 cabins and a liberty pole. 6 of the cabins were strung along one side of a deep canyon, and the other 5 faced them. The rest of the landscape was made up of bleak mountain walls that rose so high into the sky from both sides of the canyon that the village was left, as it were, far down in the bottom of a crevice. It was always daylight on the mountain tops a long time before the darkness lifted and revealed Unionville. We built a small rude cabin in the side of the crevice and roofed it with canvas, leaving a corner open to serve as a chimney, through which the cattle used to tumble occasionally at night and mash our furniture and interrupt our sleep. It was very cold weather, and fuel was scarce. Indians brought brush and bushes several miles on their backs, and when we could catch a laden Indian it was well, and when we could not, which was the rule, not the exception, we shivered and bore it. I confess, without shame, that I expected to find masses of silver lying all about the ground. I expected to see it glittering in the sun on the mountain summits. I said nothing about this, for some instinct told me that I might possibly have an exaggerated idea about it, and so if I betrayed my thought I might bring derision upon myself. Yet I was as perfectly satisfied in my own mind as I could be of anything that I was going to gather up, in a day or two, or at furthest a week or two, silver enough to make me satisfactorily wealthy, and so my fancy was already busy with plans for spending this money. The first opportunity that offered, I sauntered carelessly away from the cabin, keeping an eye on the other boys, and stopping and contemplating the sky when they seemed to be observing me. But as soon as the coast was manifestly clear, I fled away as guiltily as a thief might have done, and never halted till I was far beyond sight and call. Then I began my search with a feverish excitement that was brimful of expectation, almost of certainty. I crawled about the ground, seizing and examining bits of stone, blowing the dust from them or rubbing them on my clothes, and then peering at them with anxious hope. Presently I found a bright fragment, and my heart bounded. I hid behind a boulder and polished it and scrutinized it with a nervous eagerness and a delight that was more pronounced than absolute certainty itself could have afforded. The more I examined the fragment, the more I was convinced that I had found the door to fortune. I marked the spot and carried away my specimen. Up and down the rugged mountainside I searched, with always increasing interest and always augmenting gratitude that I had come to Humboldt and come in time. Of all the experiences of my life, this secret search among the hidden treasures of Silverland was the nearest to unmarred ecstasy. It was a delirious revel. By and by, in the bed of a shallow rivulet, I found a deposit of shining yellow scales, and my breath almost forsook me. A gold mine, and in my simplicity I had been content with vulgar silver. I was so excited that I half believed my overwrought imagination was deceiving me. Then a fear came upon me that people might be observing me and would guess my secret. Moved by this thought, I made a circuit of the place and ascended a knoll to reconnoiter. Solitude. No creature was near. Then I returned to my mine, fortifying myself against possible disappointment, but my fears were groundless. The shining scales were still there. I set about scooping them out, and for an hour I toiled down the windings of the stream and robbed its bed, but at last the descending sun warned me to give up the quest, and I turned homeward laden with wealth. As I walked along I could not help smiling at the thought of my being so excited over my fragment of silver when a nobler metal was almost under my nose. In this little time the former had so fallen in my estimation that once or twice I was on the point of throwing it away. The boys were as hungry as usual, but I could eat nothing. Neither could I talk. I was full of dreams and far away. Their conversation interrupted the flow of my fancy somewhat, and annoyed me a little, too. I despised the sordid and commonplace things they talked about, but as they proceeded it began to amuse me. It grew to be rare fun to hear them planning their poor little economies and sighing over possible privations and distresses when a gold mine all our own lay within sight of the cabin, and I could point it out at any moment. Smothered hilarity began to oppress me presently. It was hard to resist the impulse to burst out with exultation and reveal everything, but I did resist. I said within myself that I would filter the great news through my lips calmly and be serene as a summer morning while I watched its effect in their faces. I said, "Where have you all been?" "Prospecting." "What did you find?" "Nothing." "Nothing? What do you think of the country?" "Can't tell yet," said Mr. Ballou, who was an old gold miner and had likewise had considerable experience among the silver mines. "Well, haven't you formed any sort of opinion?" "Yes, a sort of a one. It's fair enough here, maybe, but overrated. $7,000 ledges are scarce, though." "That Sheba may be rich enough, but we don't own it. And besides, the rock is so full of base metals that all the science in the world can't work it. We'll not starve here, but we'll not get rich, I'm afraid." "So you think the prospect is pretty poor?" "No name for it." "Well, we'd better go back, hadn't we?" "Oh, not yet. Of course not. We'll try at a riffle first. Suppose, now, this is merely a supposition, you know, suppose you could find a ledge that would yield, say, $150 a ton. Would that satisfy you?" "Try us once," from the whole party. Or suppose, merely a supposition, of course, suppose you were to find a ledge that would yield $2,000 a ton. Would that satisfy you? Here, what do you mean? What are you coming at? Is there some mystery behind all this? Never mind. I'm not saying anything. You know perfectly well there are no rich mines here. Of course you do, because you have been around and examined for yourselves. Anybody would know that has been around. But just for the sake of argument, suppose, in a kind of a general way, suppose some person were to tell you that $2,000 ledges were simply contemptible, understand, and that right yonder in sight of this very cabin there were piles of pure gold and pure silver, oceans of it, enough to make you all rich in 24 hours. Come." "I should say he was as crazy as a loon," said old Balloon, but wild with excitement nevertheless. "Gentlemen," said I don't say anything. I haven't been around, you know, and of course don't know anything, but all I ask of you is to cast your eye on that, for instance, and tell me what you think of it." And I tossed my treasure before them. There was an eager scramble for it, and a closing of heads together over it under the candlelight. Then old Blue said, "Think of it? I think it is nothing but a lot of granite rubbish and nasty glittering mica that isn't worth 10 cents an acre." So vanished my dream. So melted my wealth away. So toppled my airy castle to the earth and left me stricken and forlorn. Moralizing, I observed then that all that glitters is not gold. Mr. Ballou said I could go further than that, and lay it up among my treasures of knowledge that nothing that glitters is gold. So I learned then, once for all, that gold in its native state is but dull, unornamental stuff, and that only low-brow metals excite the admiration of the ignorant with an ostentatious glitter. However, like the rest of the world, I still go on underrating men of gold and glorifying men of mica. Commonplace human nature cannot rise above that. End of chapter 28. This is chapter 29 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 29. True knowledge of the nature of silver mining came fast enough. We went out prospecting with Mr. Ballou. We climbed the mountain sides and clambered among sagebrush, rocks, and snow till we were ready to drop with exhaustion, but found no silver, nor yet any gold. Day after day we did this. Now and then we came upon holes burrowed a few feet into the declivities, and apparently abandoned, and now and then we found one or two listless men still burrowing, but there was no appearance of silver. These holes were the beginnings of tunnels, and the purpose was to drive them hundreds of feet into the mountain, and some day tap the hidden ledge where the silver was. Some day. It seemed far enough away, and very hopeless and dreary. Day after day we toiled and climbed and searched, and We younger partners grew sicker and still sicker of the promiseless toil. At last we halted under a beetling rampart of rock which projected from the earth high upon the mountain. Mr. Ballou broke off some fragments with a hammer, and examined them long and attentively with a small eye-glass, threw them away and broke off more, said this rock was quartz, and quartz was the sort of rock that contained silver. Contained it! I had thought that at least it would be caked on the outside of it like a kind of veneering. He still broke off pieces and critically examined them, now and then wetting the piece with his tongue and applying the glass. At last he exclaimed, "We've got it!" We were full of anxiety in a moment. The rock was clean and white, where it was broken, and across it ran a ragged thread of blue. He said that that little thread had silver in it, mixed with base metal, such as lead and antimony, and other rubbish, and that there was a speck or two of gold visible. After a great deal of effort we managed to discern some little fine yellow specks, and judged that a couple of tons of them massed together might make a gold dollar, possibly. We were not jubilant, but Mr. Ballou said there were worse ledges in the world than that. He saved what he called the richest piece of the rock, in order to determine its value by the process called the fire assay. Then we named the mine Monarch of the Mountains. Modesty of nomenclature is not a prominent feature in the mines, and Mr. Ballou wrote out and stuck up the following notice, preserving a copy to be entered upon the books in the mining recorder's office in the town. Notice: we the undersigned claim 3 claims of 300 feet each, and 1 for discovery, on this silver-bearing quartz, lead, or lode, extending north and south from this notice, with all its dips, spurs, and angles, variations, and sinuosities, together with 50 feet of ground on either side for working the same. We put our names to it and tried to feel that our fortunes were made, but when we talked the matter all over with Mr. Ballou, we felt depressed and dubious. He said that this surface quartz was not all there was of our mine, but that the wall or ledge of rock called the Monarch of the Mountains extended down hundreds and hundreds of feet into the earth. He illustrated by saying it was like a curbstone, and maintained a nearly uniform thickness, say 20 feet, away down into the bowels of the earth, and was perfectly distinct from the casing rock on each side of it, and that it kept to itself and maintained its distinctive character always, no matter how deep it extended into the earth, or how far it stretched itself through and across the hills and valleys. He said it might be a mile deep and 10 miles long, for all we knew, and that wherever we bored into it, above ground or below, we would find gold and silver in it, but no gold or silver in the meaner rock it was cased between. And he said that down in the great depths of the ledge was its richness, and the deeper it went the richer it grew. Therefore, instead of working here on the surface, we must either bore down into the rock with a shaft till we came to where it was rich, say 100 feet or so, or else we must go down into the valley and bore a long tunnel into the mountainside and tap the ledge far under the earth. To do either was plainly the labor of months, for we could blast and bore only a few feet a day, some 5 or 6. But this was not all. He said that after we got the ore out it must be hauled in wagons to a distant silver mill, ground up, and the silver extracted by a tedious and costly process. Our fortune seemed a century away. But we went to work. We decided to sink a shaft, so for a week we climbed the mountain, laden with picks, drills, gads, crowbars, shovels, cans of blasting powder, and coils of fuse, and strove with might and main. At first the rock was broken and loosed, and we dug it up with picks and threw it out with shovels, and the whole progressed very well. But the rock became more compact presently, and gads and crowbars came into play. But shortly nothing could make an impression but blasting powder. That was the weariest work. One of us held the iron drill in its place, and another would strike it with an 8-pound sledge. It was like driving nails on a large scale. In the course of an hour or two the drill would reach a depth of 2 or 3 feet, making a hole a couple of inches in diameter. We would put in a charge of powder, insert a half a yard of fuse, pour in sand and gravel and ram it down, then light the fuse and run. When the explosion came and the rocks and smoke shot into the air, we would go back and find about a bushel of that hard, rebellious quartz jolted out. Nothing more. 1 week of this satisfied me. I resigned. Claggett and Oliphant followed. Our shaft was only 12 feet deep. We decided that a tunnel was the thing we wanted. So we went down the mountainside and worked a week, at the end of which time we had blasted a tunnel about deep enough to hide a hogshead in, and judged that about 900 feet more of it would reach the ledge. I resigned again, and the other boys only held out 1 day longer. We decided that a tunnel was not what we wanted. We wanted a ledge that was already developed. There were none in the camp. We dropped the Monarch for the time being. Meantime, the camp was filling up with people, and there was a constantly growing excitement about our Humboldt mines. We fell victims to the epidemic and strained every nerve to acquire more feet. We prospected and took up new claims, put notices on them, and gave them grandiloquent names. We traded some of our feet for feet in other people's claims. In a little while we owned largely in the Gray Eagle, the Columbiana, the Branch Mint, the Maria Jane, the Universe, the Root Hog or Die, the Samson and Delilah, the Treasure Trove, the Golconda, the Sultana, the Boomerang, the Great Republic, the Grand Mogul, and 50 other mines that had never been molested by a shovel or scratched with a pick. We had not less than 30,000 feet apiece in the richest mines on earth, as the frenzied cant phrased it, and we were in debt to the butcher. We were stark mad with excitement, drunk with happiness, smothered under mountains of prospective wealth, arrogantly compassionate toward the plodding millions who knew not our marvelous canyon. But our credit was not good at the grocer's. It was the strangest phase of life one can imagine. It was a beggar's revel. There was nothing doing in the district, no mining, no milling, no productive effort, no income, and not enough money in the entire camp to buy a corner lot in an eastern village hardly. And yet a stranger would have supposed he was walking among bloated millionaires. Prospecting parties swarmed out of town with the first flush of dawn, and swarmed in again at nightfall laden with spoil. Rocks. Nothing but rocks. Every man's pockets were full of them. The floor of his cabin was littered with them. They were disposed in labeled rows on his shelves. End of chapter 29. This is chapter 30 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 30. I met men at every turn who owned from 1,000 to 30,000 feet in undeveloped silver mines, every single foot of which they believed would shortly be worth from $50 to $1,000, and as often as any other way they were men who had not $25 in the world. Every man you met had his new mine to boast of, and his specimens ready, and if the opportunity offered, he would infallibly back you into a corner and offer as a favor to you, not to him, to part with just a few feet in the Golden Age, or the Sarah Jane, or some other unknown stack of croppings, for money enough to get a square meal with, as the phrase went. And you were never to reveal that he made you the offer at such a ruinous price, for it was only out of friendship for you that he was willing to make the sacrifice. Then he would fish a piece of rock out of his pocket, and after looking mysteriously around, as if he feared he might be waylaid and robbed if caught with such wealth in his possession, he would dab the rock against his tongue, clap an eyeglass to it, and exclaim, "Look at that! Right there in that red dirt! See it? See the specks of gold? And the streak of silver? That's from the Uncle Abe. There's 100,000 tons like that in sight. Right in sight, mind you. And when we get down on it, and the ledge comes in solid, it will be the richest thing in the world. Look at the assay. I don't want you to believe me. Look at the assay." Then he would get out a greasy sheet of paper which showed that the portion of rock assayed had given evidence of containing silver and gold in the proportion of so many hundreds or thousands of dollars to the ton. I little knew then that the custom was to hunt out the richest piece of rock and get it assayed. Very often that piece, the size of a filbert, was the only fragment in a ton that had a particle of metal in it, and yet the assay made it pretend to represent the average value of the ton of rubbish it came from. On such a system of assaying as that, the Humboldt world had gone crazy. On the authority of such assays, its newspaper correspondents were frothing about rock worth $4,000 and $7,000 a ton. And, does the reader remember, a few pages back, the calculations of a quoted correspondent whereby the ore is to be mined and shipped all the way to England, the metals extracted, and the gold and silver contents received back by the miners as clear profit, the copper, antimony, and other things in the ore being sufficient to pay all the expenses incurred? Everybody's head was full of such calculations as those, such raving insanity, rather. Few people took work into their calculations, or outlay of money either, except the work and expenditures of other people. We never touched our tunnel or shaft again. Why? Because we judged that we had learned the real secret of success in silver mining, which was, not to mine the silver ourselves by the sweat of our brows and the labor of our hands, but to sell the ledges to the dull slaves of toil and let them do the mining. Before leaving Carson, the secretary and I had purchased feet from various Esmeralda stragglers. We had expected immediate returns of bullion, but were only afflicted with regular and constant assessments instead, demands for money wherewith to develop the said mines. These assessments had grown so oppressive that it seemed necessary to look into the matter personally. Therefore, I projected a pilgrimage to Carson and thence to Esmeralda. I bought a horse and started, in company with Mr. Ballou and a gentleman named Ollendorf, a Prussian, not the party who has inflicted so much suffering on the world with his wretched foreign grammars, with their interminable repetitions of questions which never have occurred and are never likely to occur in any conversation among human beings. We rode through a snowstorm for 2 or 3 days and arrived at Honey Lake Smith's, a sort of isolated inn on the Carson River. It was a 2-story log house situated on a small knoll in the midst of the vast basin or desert through which the sickly Carson winds its melancholy way. Close to the house were the overland stage stables, built of sun-dried bricks. There was not another building within several leagues of the place. Toward sunset about 20 hay wagons arrived and camped out around the house, and all the teamsters came in to supper, a very, very rough set. There were 1 or 2 overland stage drivers there also, and a half-dozen vagabonds and stragglers. Consequently, the house was well crowded. We walked out, after supper, and visited a small Indian camp in the vicinity. The Indians were in a great hurry about something, and were packing up and getting away as fast as they could. In their broken English they said, "Bime-by heap water," and by the help of signs made us understand that in their opinion a flood was coming. The weather was perfectly clear, and this was not the rainy season. There was about a foot of water in the insignificant river, or maybe 2 feet. The stream was not wider than a back alley in a village, and its banks were scarcely higher than a man's head. So where was the flood to come from? We canvassed the subject a while, and then concluded it was a ruse, and that the Indians had some better reason for leaving in a hurry than fears of a flood in such an exceedingly dry time. At 7 in the evening we went to bed in the 2nd story, with our clothes on, as usual, and all 3 in the same bed, for every available space on the floors, chairs, etc., was in request, and even then there was barely room for the housing of the inn's guests. An hour later we were awakened by a great turmoil, and springing out of bed we picked our way nimbly among the ranks of snoring teamsters on the floor, and got to the front windows of the long room. A glance revealed a strange spectacle under the moonlight. The crooked Carson was full to the brim, and its waters were raging and foaming in the wildest way, sweeping around the sharp bends at a furious speed, and bearing on their surface a chaos of logs, brush, and all sorts of rubbish. A depression where its bed had once been in other times was already filling, and in 1 or 2 places the water was beginning to wash over the main bank. Men were flying hither and thither, bringing cattle and wagons close up to the house, for the spot of high ground on which it stood extended only some 30 feet in front and about 100 in the rear. Close to the old river bed just spoken of stood a little log stable, and in this our horses were lodged. While we looked, the waters increased so fast in this place that in a few minutes a torrent was roaring by the little stable and its margin encroaching steadily on the logs. We suddenly realized that this flood was not a mere holiday spectacle, but meant damage, and not only to the small log stable, but to the overland buildings close to the main river, for the waves had now come ashore and were creeping about the foundations and invading the great hay corral adjoining. We ran down and joined the crowd of excited men and frightened animals. We waded knee-deep into the log stable, unfastened the horses, and waded out almost waist-deep, so fast the water increased. Then the crowd rushed in a body to the hay corral and began to tumble down the huge stacks of baled hay and roll the bales up on high ground by the house. Meantime it was discovered that Owens, an overland driver, was missing, and a man ran to the large stable and, wading in boot-top deep, discovered him asleep in his bed, awoke him, and waded out again. But Owens was drowsy and resumed his nap, but only for a minute or two, for presently he turned in his bed, his hand dropped over the side and came in contact with the cold water. It was up level with the mattress. He waded out breast deep almost, and the next moment the sunburned bricks melted down like sugar, and the big building crumbled to a ruin and was washed away in a twinkling. At 11 o'clock only the roof of the little log stable was out of water, and our inn was on an island in mid-ocean. As far as the eye could reach in the moonlight there was no desert visible, but only a level waste of shining water. The Indians were true prophets, but how did they get their information? I am not able to answer the question. We remained cooped up 8 days and nights with that curious crew. Swearing, drinking, and card-playing were the order of the day, and occasionally a fight was thrown in for variety. Dirt and vermin, but let us forget those features. Their profusion is simply inconceivable. It is better that they remain so. There were 2 men. However, this chapter is long enough. End of chapter 30.